are still happening today, and then the unsanctioned acts of terror, which we also see today. So is that interplay different now, in your view, than it was in the American South during that time period? And how so?
We don't know. So this is something that political scientists, as well as almost all other social observers, have been shutting our eyes to over the last 10 or 20 years, right? Or longer. This rise of militia groups, of far-right, usually white nationalists, Christian nationalists, what have you, groups. They've been organizing slowly. They've been committing sporadic acts of violence since the early 1990s, again, before your time, but this famous bombing in 1995 of a federal building in Oklahoma City. The Michigan militia actually was quite a bit bigger deal back then. We've had kind of a cessation of that. I mean, America remains an incredibly violent country, but there hasn't been a lot of collective political violence by non-state actors, right? Whatever you think the Chicago PD does, we haven't had large groups of militia members going into battle, pitched battles against other groups. That's what I mean.
I wonder, how would you frame that given the events of January 6th?
Well, I'm working up to that. So you're right. So that's very different. But so think about what we didn't see with the Black Lives Matter marches that I'm worrying we will see this summer. We saw tons of violence by state actors, by police officers, Lafayette Square, right, in D.C. What we didn't see was them being joined by not one, but 100 Kyle Rittenhouses firing into crowds, killing hundreds of people, which again is a not unusual thing to happen in highly diverse, ethnically, religiously, racially diverse countries around the world. I, of course, like you and like a lot of other people, worry about what positive lessons a lot of would-be collective non-state actors, militia members, and so on are going to learn from January 6th. It's worth thinking about the difficulty for public officials in both Washington and at the state level in reckoning with this kind of violence. If you think back to how the federal government responded to the Klan in the 1960s, it was through one of the most successful programs of state repression, and that was the counterintelligence program targeting the Ku Klux Klan in the South. The FBI helped bring down the Klan in the 1960s by infiltrating it, penetrating it, bringing it down from inside. In a program that was kind of parallel and running at the exact same time as the program they ran to bring down Black nationalists, Black Panther Party, and so on. I'm imagining that in the U.S., when we have violence, we often overreact in a way that restricts civil rights and civil liberties. We did that with the Patriot Act after 9/11. I'm guessing that there are going to be a lot of political progressives who are going to wish that they were as focused on civil rights and civil liberties this year as I fear they won't be, looking back 5 years later. In other words, I feel like the MSNBC crowd is going to be very comfortable with re-weaponizing Homeland Security in ways that are effective at hurting, infiltrating far-right groups, but in ways that leave behind a maybe too-power federal government when it comes to restricting movements that they like later on. Another important partisan political dynamic will be how governors of different political parties respond to this coming summer's crowd violence. And I do expect there will be a lot of far-right crowd violence committed by non-state actors, militia groups, and so on, against, say, left-wing, Black Lives Matter, other marches. So how is Governor Whitmer going to respond differently than the governor of, say, Ohio, who's a Republican? The pressures that those governors face are going to be very, very different. You can imagine that Governor Whitmer, a Democrat, wanting to use the Michigan State Highway Patrol to crack down on this violence in a way that upsets the state legislature. Maybe in a way that's not even doable because maybe the Michigan state highway patrol is itself penetrated already by white nationalists. So I worry about that, but I also worry about Republican governors not responding by cracking down on far-right private collective violence when they should, by calling out the National Guard, because this violence is being committed by people who Marjorie Taylor Greene and others see as members in good standing of the Republican Party. And then that's when the Biden administration will be put in a box not unlike President Eisenhower in the 1950s. The governor of Arkansas won't deter and repress white crowd violence when schools are being desegregated. He won't enforce the federal court orders requiring the desegregation of schools in Little Rock, drags his heels, forces Eisenhower to send in U.S. paratroopers. In 1962, there are more members of the U.S. Army in Oxford, Mississippi, an extremely small town, after the riots at the University of Mississippi when it was being desegregated. There are more U.S. Army personnel there in that tiny town than were at North Korean, South Korean border, more than 30,000. Again, I'm just thinking about city officials, state officials, given their partisan membership, reacting very differently to the violence that I expect we're going to be engulfed in for the next several years.
Usually I like to end the podcast on a hopeful note. Given your last answer there, what, if anything, can be done to improve the situation?
Parties don't really shift substantially until they've lost multiple times. For Republican office holders and people wanting to use the Republican Party label to win elections, they are not going to fully divorce themselves from this tiny part of their party, tiny but very destructive part of their party, until they see massive electoral costs from continuing to aid and abet. So for me, the really critical next step is what happens in the 2022 congressional primaries and in the 2022 congressional election. This country will get a lot more peaceful when the National Republican Party thinks it learns a big lesson from a big loss. And that loss can either come from November or from nominating crazy people who lose in November. And then it would probably take them losing another presidential election in 2024. Parties change slowly. People keep talking about the Republican Party is broken, racked with civil war. Part of me says, kind of. The other part of me says, boy, for a broken party, they sure win a lot. They control a majority of state legislatures, governorships, and so on. They'll probably win back the House. They might retake the Senate. If that's broken, sign me up. So the reason why that's a problem is because I don't see the Republican Party as anywhere close to suffering consecutive losses and enough to change its tune. If Americans can do anything, it would be to vote in Republican congressional primary elections, which maybe a lot of your listeners won't, but to steer the party back until we vastly change our election laws, many of which we can change without changing the Constitution. We're going to be stuck with two parties. And as long as we're stuck with two parties and one of them has gone crazy, our country's going to remain violent and crazy too. We're really in a mad dash to fix the Republican Party. So you and the rest of you young people, the more of you that can join the Republican Party and steer it back somewhere else, the better.
Well, Dr. Rob Mickey, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks.
And that's a wrap on another episode of UC3P. Credits go to me, Sidhant Wadhera, for producing, interviewing, and editing this episode. Thank you again to Dr. Mickey for taking the time to speak with me. His book is Paths Out of Dixie, The Democratization of Authoritarian Enclaves in America's Deep South. Our assistant production managers are Jack Emery and Yowana Lapuri. Our finance director is Aishwarya Kumar. Our communications director is Olu Ogidan, and our publisher is Yining Wong. Our intro music is Knockout 2 by Datubi, and our outro music is Yes Yes Y'all by Matt Large. Our cover art was designed by Shirin Raban. Please visit us on our website, uc3p.org. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. My name is Sidhant Wadhera, and this was the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast's main page.